Los Angeles, October 15, 1979. The Forum Arena was emptying after another sold-out concert, but backstage in the narrow corridors lined with concrete walls, something was happening that would haunt Marvin Gaye for the rest of his life. A 21-year-old Michael Jackson approached him with shining eyes, still breathless, from his own performance earlier that evening. "Mr. Gaye," Michael said, his voice soft but filled with reverence, "I just wanted to tell you that you're the reason I believe music can change the world." Marvin looked at this young man, this prodigy who had been performing since childhood, and felt something crack inside his chest. It wasn't pride, it wasn't gratitude, it was terror. Because standing there in that dimly lit hallway, Marvin Gaye realized he was looking at his replacement. The meeting had been arranged by Quincy Jones, who thought the two artists should connect. Michael had just finished his set opening for the Jacksons' Destiny Tour, and Marvin was there as a guest invited by Berry Gordy, who was trying to coax him back into regular touring. Marvin had been reluctant to come. Since Tammy Terrell's death 9 years earlier, he found it increasingly difficult to be around other performers, especially young ones whose careers were ascending while his felt stagnant. Michael stood there in his sequin jacket, still glittering under the harsh backstage lights, and continued speaking with an enthusiasm that made Marvin's stomach turn. "What's going on changed everything for me," Michael said. "The way you made music about real things, serious things. I want to do that too. I want my music to matter like yours does." Marvin nodded politely, managed a weak smile, but said nothing. He couldn't speak because his throat had closed up, not from emotion, but from a kind of suffocating panic. This kid, this impossibly talented kid, was talking about surpassing everything Marvin had accomplished as if it were just the natural next step in his career. And the worst part was, Marvin believed he could do it. Michael continued talking, mentioning specific songs, specific moments in Marvin's catalog that had influenced him. He spoke about the vulnerability in Mercy, Mercy Me, the political courage of Inner City Blues, the raw honesty of Trouble Man. Every compliment felt like a nail in Marvin's creative coffin, because Michael wasn't just praising Marvin's past. He was studying it, dissecting it, learning from it, preparing to build something even greater on top of it. "I've been working on this album," Michael said, his eyes bright with possibility, "and I keep thinking about how you made What's Going On all by yourself, how you fought for your vision. That's what I want to do, create something that's completely mine." Marvin finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "That's good, son. You should do that." But inside, Marvin was screaming. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours to Marvin. When Michael finally said goodbye, shaking Marvin's hand with both of his own, expressing how much the meeting meant to him, Marvin watched him walk away down that concrete corridor and knew something fundamental had changed, not just in his career, but in his understanding of where he stood in the hierarchy of music history. He was no longer the future. He was the past. That night, Marvin drove home through the empty streets of Los Angeles, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quiet. Michael Jackson represented everything Marvin was losing: youth, energy, optimism, the belief that music could heal the world rather than just reflect its pain. Michael had grown up in the industry, but somehow retained an innocence about it that Marvin had lost years ago. Where Marvin saw corruption, manipulation, and exploitation, Michael still saw possibility. It wasn't fair. Marvin had paid his dues, had fought the battles, had sacrificed his mental health and personal relationships for his art. And now this kid was going to waltz in and claim the throne without understanding what it cost to build it. But what made it even worse was that Marvin genuinely liked Michael. There was nothing false or calculating about him. His admiration seemed pure, his talent was undeniable, and his ambition was coupled with a humility that Marvin found both refreshing and infuriating. Michael wasn't trying to steal anything. He was simply becoming what he was meant to become. And that natural progression threatened to make everything Marvin had accomplished seem small by comparison. Over the following weeks, Marvin found himself obsessing over that conversation. He would replay Michael's words, analyzing every inflection, every pause, looking for hidden meanings that probably didn't exist. When Michael's Off the Wall album was released a few months later, Marvin bought a copy and listened to it alone in his house. and with each song his fears were confirmed. This was the future of music. Sophisticated, polished, emotionally intelligent, commercially brilliant. Everything Marvin's own recent work was not. Marvin's last album, Here My Dear, had been an angry, bitter meditation on his divorce that had confused critics and alienated fans. It was honest, perhaps too honest, but it wasn't aspirational in the way Michael's music was. Michael was creating music for people who wanted to feel better about the world. Marvin was creating music for people who were as broken as he was, and there weren't as many of those people in the market. The irony wasn't lost on Marvin that Michael was everything he had once been at Motown. Young, eager, willing to collaborate with the label's vision while still maintaining artistic integrity. But where Marvin had eventually rebelled, fought against the system, and paid the price in terms of commercial viability, Michael seemed to be finding ways to work within the system while still achieving his creative goals. It was a more mature approach, a wiser approach, and it made Marvin feel like a cautionary tale rather than a pioneer. As months passed, Michael's star continued to rise while Marvin's continued to fade. The industry that had once celebrated Marvin as a visionary was now looking toward younger artists who could deliver the same depth, but with more polish, more commercial appeal, more optimism. The world had moved on from the angry, questioning tone of, "What's going on?" People wanted music that acknowledged problems, but also offered solutions, hope, transcendence. Michael was giving them that. Marvin no longer knew how to. The meeting with Michael had exposed a truth Marvin had been trying to avoid. He was becoming irrelevant, not because his talent had diminished, but because his worldview was too dark, too pessimistic, too wounded for the direction popular music was heading. The industry wanted artists who could transform pain into joy, not artists who wallowed in pain as an end in itself. Marvin started using drugs more heavily after that night. Cocaine became his primary companion, the only thing that could quiet the voices in his head telling him his best days were behind him. He stopped answering calls from Berry Gordy, stopped responding to invitations to collaborate, stopped attending industry events where he might encounter other young artists who would remind him of his declining relevance. The paranoia that had always been a part of Marvin's personality intensified. He became convinced that people were actively working to erase his legacy, that younger artists were intentionally stealing his innovations without giving him credit, that the industry was conspiring to replace him with safer, more manageable versions of what he had created. None of this was necessarily true, but truth became less important than the narrative that allowed Marvin to make sense of his fading influence. In 1980, when Marvin fled to Europe to escape his financial and personal problems, he carried with him the image of Michael Jackson's shining eyes, the memory of being told he was an inspiration by someone who was clearly destined to surpass him. It became a symbol of everything he was running from: the industry that had chewed him up, the young artists who were taking his place, the future he would never be part of. During his exile in Belgium, when Marvin was at his lowest point, struggling with addiction and contemplating suicide, he would sometimes think about Michael. He wondered if Michael's career would follow the same trajectory as his own, if the industry would eventually break him too, if success would ultimately prove to be as hollow as failure. But deep down, Marvin suspected Michael was different, stronger, smarter, more adaptable. The kind of artist who could maintain his integrity without sacrificing his sanity, who could navigate the industry without losing himself completely. It was both comforting and devastating to imagine. When Marvin returned to America in 1982 and recorded Sexual Healing, achieving his first major hit in years, there was a brief moment where he thought he might be able to compete again. But Michael's Thriller was released that same year, and it obliterated all comparison. Michael hadn't just created a great album. He had redefined what popular music could be, what level of artistic and commercial success was possible. Everything Marvin had accomplished suddenly seemed quaint by comparison. That meeting in 1979 had been prophetic. Michael had told Marvin he was an inspiration, and he had meant it sincerely. But what Michael had really been saying, without realizing it, was goodbye. He was acknowledging Marvin's contribution before moving beyond it, taking what was valuable from Marvin's legacy and transforming it into something entirely new. By 1983, when Michael was performing the moonwalk on Motown 25, cementing his status as the king of pop, Marvin was back in his childhood home, battling depression and addiction, fighting with his father, slowly dying from the inside out. He never spoke publicly about Michael Jackson, never expressed any resentment or jealousy in interviews. But those who knew Marvin during his final years said he would sometimes mention that kid from Indiana when discussing the state of the music industry, always with a mixture of admiration and resignation. The years that followed that backstage meeting became a slow-motion suicide for Marvin. Every Michael Jackson milestone felt like another step away from relevance. When Don't Stop Till You Get Enough topped the charts, Marvin was fighting with his second wife about money. When Rock With You dominated radio, Marvin was explaining to his children why Daddy had to go away for a while. When Billie Jean became a cultural phenomenon, Marvin was hiding in his father's house, afraid to leave his bedroom. The most painful part wasn't Michael's success itself. It was how easy Michael made it look. Where Marvin had always struggled with every creative decision, agonizing over lyrics, battling with producers, fighting for artistic control, Michael seemed to glide through the industry with an effortless grace that made Marvin's decades of conflict seem unnecessary and self-destructive. Marvin began to rewrite his own history in his mind. Maybe he hadn't been a pioneer. Maybe he had just been difficult. Maybe his battles with Motown hadn't been about artistic integrity, but about his own inability to work within reasonable constraints. Maybe the pain he had channeled into his music wasn't profound, but simply indulgent. These thoughts consumed him during the long nights in his bedroom on Gramercy Place, where he would lie awake replaying conversations from 20 years ago, wondering if he had misunderstood his own purpose in the music world. The cocaine made these thought spirals worse, amplifying every doubt, every regret, every fear about his legacy. He started avoiding music altogether. Radio was torture because every song reminded him of what he was no longer capable of creating. Television was worse because MTV had launched, and suddenly visual presentation was as important as musical content. Marvin looked in the mirror and saw a middle-aged man who had lost his looks, his voice, his relevance, his reason for existing. When friends tried to encourage him, suggesting collaborations or comeback albums, Marvin would mention Michael Jackson as proof that the game had changed beyond recognition. "You see what that kid is doing?" he would say. "That's what music is now. I don't know how to do that." But the truth was more complicated. Marvin could have adapted, could have found his place in the changing landscape of popular music. Other artists from his generation were doing it successfully. The real problem was that meeting Michael had shattered his confidence so completely that he no longer believed he deserved success. Michael had been so young, so respectful, so genuinely inspired by Marvin's work, and instead of feeling honored, Marvin had felt exposed, because Michael's innocence had highlighted just how cynical and bitter Marvin had become. Michael saw possibility where Marvin saw only obstacles. Michael believed music could heal where Marvin was convinced it could only wound. The generational divide wasn't just about age or style, it was about hope, and Marvin had lost his somewhere along the way. During his darkest period in Belgium, when Marvin was contemplating ending his life, he would think about that conversation with Michael. He wondered if this was how every generation of artists felt when the next wave arrived. Was this just the natural cycle of artistic evolution, or was he particularly weak for taking it so personally? The questions tormented him because there were no answers. Art wasn't a competition, but the music industry was. Legacy was supposed to be about impact, not charts. But try explaining that to someone whose royalty checks were shrinking every year. The worst part was that Michael was doing everything right. He was humble in interviews, gracious to his predecessors, politically conscious without being preachy, commercially successful without sacrificing artistry. He was everything Marvin had tried to be, but had failed to sustain. These thoughts followed Marvin back to America when he returned in 1982. Even as sexual healing climbed the charts and reminded people of his talent, Marvin couldn't escape the feeling that he was living on borrowed time. Michael's Thriller was dominating the cultural conversation in ways that made sexual healing success seem modest and temporary by comparison. In his final interviews conducted in the months before his death, Marvin would sometimes mention young artists who were taking music in exciting directions. He never said Michael's name, but everyone knew who he meant. There was always a sadness in his voice when he spoke about the future of music, as if he was discussing a party he hadn't been invited to. The tragic irony was that Michael Jackson genuinely revered Marvin Gaye throughout his career. In private conversations with friends and collaborators, Michael would often reference Marvin as one of his primary influences, someone whose fearless approach to personal and political themes had given him permission to be vulnerable in his own music. Michael never knew that their brief meeting had triggered such a profound crisis of confidence in Marvin. He never knew that his innocent expression of admiration had been interpreted as a changing of the guard. If he had known, it would have broken his heart, because Michael understood better than most what it felt like to be consumed by the pressures of the music industry. But that's the cruel mathematics of artistic influence. The person who inspires you rarely knows they've done it, and the person you inspire may experience that inspiration as a kind of death, a reminder that their moment has passed. When Marvin's father pulled the trigger on April 1st, 1984, one day before Marvin's 45th birthday, Michael Jackson was performing to sold-out stadiums around the world, carrying forward a musical tradition that Marvin had helped create but could no longer claim as his own. The meeting between them had lasted 10 minutes in that concrete backstage hallway. The shadow it cast over Marvin lasted the rest of his life, because sometimes the most destructive conversations are the ones where nothing cruel is ever said, where the other person means only pure kindness, where the pain comes not from malice, but from the simple, unavoidable forward passage of time itself. Michael Jackson had looked at Marvin Gaye with pure love and deep respect and told him he was an inspiration. And in that very moment of generosity, Marvin truly saw his own ending beginning to unfold.